Do you draw any musical influence at all from someone like Stockhausen?
For me, all influences are totally subconscious, I think. I'm not really aware where they're coming from. But I know that it's happening. It's got to happen, you know.
But we are very into sort of timeless, ageless, spacious sort of moods in our music, very often atmospheric.
Floyd, a psychedelic art, progressive kind of rock band, right? Formed in London of 1965, released a total of 15 studio albums, and are easily one of the most successful bands to emerge from what most people refer to as the British invasion. Now, I'm not just going to sit here and give you a history rundown of the band, but what I am going to do is give you a very in-depth analysis of the band's most iconic and successful records called The Dark Side of the Moon. The Dark Side of the Moon was released in 1973 and is one of the 25 best-selling records in the United States still to this day. The album features a total of 10 tracks using concepts based off of things like greed, conflict, the passing of time, and insanity. The insanity part was apparently based off of one of the ex-members, Syd Barrett. He's a co-founder of Pink Floyd, and he departed in 1968.
We'd been to a meeting at the Capitol Tower in Los Angeles, and Sid and I were walking down the street, and we stopped at the traffic light at Hollywood Boulevard and Vine Street in Los Angeles. And he looked at me and smiled, and he said, "It's nice here in Las Vegas, isn't it?" Well, we were in LA, so that he already had no idea where he was, even like that. Then his face darkened, and he looked down at the ground and spat out one word: people. And that sort of encapsulates what it was like. Nothing made any sense.
Disjointed.
Blank, disjointed.
So what I find really unique about this album, especially for its time, was how each track leads into one another, kind of like a film score. And this was a relatively new concept for records back in the day, and each song would represent sort of a stage in life. With the first song called Speak to Me, with a beating heart at the beginning, like a newborn. And the last song, Eclipse, ending with the beating heart kind of fading out, like you're dying. So I am here to answer one simple question. What makes this album so iconic and so genius? More specifically, from a compositional and music theory standpoint, what did Gilmour and Waters and Mason and Wright create to make an album that a lot of people would call the perfect album? I'll be diving into each song, highlighting and explaining some of the best music theory compositional aspects. So, without further ado, here is The Dark Side of the Moon. The first track, Speak to Me, begins with a beating heart, like I said earlier. It slowly fades in with the sounds of cash registers, clocks, and a conversation about going mad.
I've been mad for fucking years.
Slowly, more sound design fades in with a belty scream fading in just before we roll into the next song, Breathe. So we're kind of setting the stage for the album here. And one thing to note, this album uses a ton of sound design or sounds with things other than instruments. So a lot of film scores or just films in general use. So things like a clock or cash register or things like objects and things like that. That's what sound design is. So Breathe in the Air is the second track off the record. Now getting into the instruments. So starting in the key of E minor, or that's what we will call it for now, we wound up using a 1 to a 4 chord progression, but the 4 chord is major, so A major. The E minor chord also uses some really nice chord extensions, like the minor 7 and then the added 9th. Chord extensions, if you're new to it, basically adds more thirds stacked onto the triad, right? So instead of using root third fifth, we can do root third fifth 7 or root third fifth 7, 9, 11, 13, etc., etc. So E minor 7 being E, B, G, D, lands into an A7, which is why most people agree we're an E Dorian. This is relatively simple because the A7 could be thought of as the dominant or the 5 chord, creating some tension. But then we vamp back to E minor 7. Now the weird part happens in the chorus. So the chorus chords go as follows: C major 7, B minor 7, F major 7, G, D7 sharp 9, D sharp diminished 7, and E minor 7. So we're now going in the key of C major, as most of these chords work in that key. You can think of the G chord as the dominant, as well as the D7 as a 5-7 of 5, which can be resolved to G major, so a secondary dominant. And that's the relative major of our original key, E minor. C major 7, which is a 1 of C, B minor 7, which is a 7 of C, F major 7, which is a 4 of C, G, which is a 5 of C, D7 sharp 9, which is a flat 7 of E minor, and then D sharp diminished, which is a diminished 7 leading tone of E minor. Keep in mind, modulating from E minor to C major isn't all that crazy since they have almost the same key signature. It doesn't sound very far off. This is one of the easiest ways to start modulating. So when it comes to your modulation for beginners, some things that you can keep in mind is when you're looking at the circle of fifths, take a look at the key that you're in and then take a look at the nearby keys that have almost the same key signature. That is where you should start when it comes to modulation, because using those keys that are in the same vicinity will equate to almost the same chords, almost the same triads, chord extensions, things like that, but just with a slight little twist, maybe like one extra sharp or one extra flat in the key signature. So when using that, it doesn't sound all that crazy to go from one key to the other. So that's a basic form of modulation that you can start using, as long as you use the tension chords to resolve to that next key properly. The last couple of chords climb up chromatically, going into the next song called On the Run. On the Run is next, with mostly sound design and a constant E minor scale repeating pattern with 16th note hi-hats on the drums. And there's a really cool video I found where somebody shows how to recreate it on the synth. It's a really awesome video. You should definitely check it out. Anyways, more synths and more sound design pass through, sounding like an airplane, someone laughing like crazy, and then a big explosion at the end. You can hear what sounds like somebody literally on the run at the end with footsteps and heavy breathing. So this is a repeating theme that we're kind of hearing with all this sound design. Time is the next tune. It's one of my favorites. Starts with a cluster of every possible old style clock mashed together with the repeating 8th note that sounds like bongos, but Songster claims that it's the bass being muted. We land in the key of F sharp minor, going back and forth with the root and the minor 7th. So F sharp minor into E. Once the drum fill kicks in, the chord progression looks like this. F sharp minor, A, E, and then F sharp minor. But then let's check out what the chorus looks like. D major 7, C sharp minor, B minor, and A. So the chorus, I'd argue, kind of uses a D Lydian chord progression. So think of Lydian as the 4th mode in major, right? So that means that you could think of it as we're borrowing from the key of A major because D is the 4th, right? What led me to that conclusion was C sharp minor, right? As well as A being at the end of the chord progression. And that's just kind of how modal writing works in general, is you pick a key, but then you start on a specific note that's not the roots, and then you call this new note the root. So in this case, the 4th scale degree, we're using it as kind of our home base. That's the easiest way to think of modes. And you just use that to write. And as you can already tell, Pink Floyd really likes their modal composition, so you're going to keep hearing that more as we go through this record. So now let's listen to the chord progression at the end. Sound familiar? Well, I hope so, because it's nearly the same cadence as the end of the chorus in Breathe, aside from the last two chords using F major, 7, then to A, and then to an E flat tritone, into B minor. And this is going to take us right into the next song called The Great Gig in the Sky, one of the best songs off the record. The Great Gig in the Sky, one of the most unique songs off the record, features a very interesting chord progression on the piano. So let's listen and have a look. So with all these chords, at a first glance and a first listen, it sounds like we're in the key of B minor. But pay close attention as to how we actually are in the key of F major. This is done pretty effectively considering we start with the B minor, but most of the chorus is in F major because B flat, the 4 chord of F major, G minor 7, the 2 chord in F, and then C9, the 5 of F. Some of the chords, like B minor of course, aren't all that uncommon using the minor 4 chord. In the middle, there's a vamp of G minor 7 and then C9, and this has a very clever modulation at 2 minutes and 18 seconds. B flat major to B flat minor, then go to G flat major, or F sharp major we can call it, then to B minor, our new tonic. Let's figure out how this modulation actually works. At a first glance, let's assume we're still in the key of F major. So the B flat major chord is the 4, and then the B flat minor chord is the borrowed 4 chord from the parallel minor F minor. To give you a brief introduction to using these parallel keys when you compose, it's really, really simple. So don't get this confused with relative keys. A relative key is basically going from the relative minor or the relative major. So the key of F major, the relative is D minor. The key of C major is A minor. The key of G major is E minor, etc., etc. You can see this on the inside of the circle fifths. Parallel is the same root, just going to the opposite, or the major to minor, minor to major. So if you're in the key of C minor, the parallel would be C major, okay? And we can borrow these chords by just grabbing them literally from the opposite key. If we're in the key of F major, but we're borrowing from the parallel minor F minor, the 4 chord, we're taking that B flat minor chord and we're going to use it in the key of F major. And that's pretty much all you got to do. Obviously, you're going to have to adjust the way you notate it. If you're using the figure-based stuff, you're just going to have to use a lowercase for the Roman numeral, things like that. Sometimes you have to put the flat sign in front of it if it's a flatted, or you have to put the sharp sign in front of it if it's sharp. There are plenty of different examples of this in all kinds of songs. This isn't something that's too crazy, but sounds really, really good and really, really smooth. So that's why I really like the song. So then the G flat major chord, or what I'd argue is the pivot chord, is better thought of as the 5 in B minor, because after we land in B minor, we're calling the 5 chord F sharp. So that G flat major chord in F is weird, no doubt, but in general, all these chords work for one simple reason, the Neo-Riemannian theory. So we're going to have a look at that in just a second, but we're going to talk about what that pivot chord is and why it's called a pivot chord. Pivot chords are exactly how they sound when it comes to modulation. You need some sort of a spot to move to the next key. To make things simple, usually a secondary dominant is the easiest way to do this and the easiest way to figure it out. So when you start seeing accidentals in the music or chords and notes that are outside of the key, there's a good chance that that or something in the area is the pivot point. You look at a piece of music and you find what you think is the pivot chord and you notate as if it's in the current key and what it is in the new key. And then at the bottom, you continue writing it from what it is in the new key. So the Neo-Riemannian theory, let's figure out what exactly this chaos is. If you want a full video and a demonstration of what the Neo-Riemannian theory is, please go ahead and click on the video and or just go in the description and it'll show everything about it. To give you a summary of it, basically throw away the circle of fifths, throw away diatonic chords and triads and stuff like that. Basically, the Neo-Riemannian theory is saying that there are other ways of getting from one chord to the other than diatonic and chordal function, which basically assumes that a triad can be moved in 3 different ways: parallel, relative, and leading tone. You can basically take any of the notes in a triad and then move them by a whole step or a half step, creating a new chord entirely. The easiest way is to look at it like this. C-E-G, its relative would be C-E-A. So you're taking the G and you're bumping it up a whole step to A. Or C-E-G can be moved to C-E flat G. So that one would be the parallel, like we're just saying. So you can do that with all sorts of different methods and ways and stuff like that. And it's a really cool way of getting from one chord to the other without using standard Western harmony. Okay, so this is my little diagram that I'll explain really quickly with how we moved all across all these crazy chords. So basically, what we can first take a look at is we have 4 different triangles that represents each a chord or a triad, okay? And basically, what I'm going to explain is how we're moving from one chord to the other really, really smoothly. And all you're going to do is look at how one pointy end, like D right here, moves to D flat, creating a brand new chord. So we have B flat, D, and F. So that's B flat major. So moving the third back a half step creates, right, B flat minor right there. So right here, we have created a B flat minor chord, and everything kind of just keeps continuing from there. So that's obviously your parallel. Okay, so now B flat, D flat, and F, we're going to move the leading tone to G flat or F sharp, creating a G flat major chord, right? Then the B flat right here is going to get moved to B, creating a B minor chord. So when you look at it like this, it can look a little bit scary, but essentially, whenever you have 3 notes in a chord, they can be just literally moving one chord, just literally moving one note in the chord back or forward creates a brand new chord. And the Neo-Riemannian theory basically just gives you a really clean way of doing it. Money is the next tune. The song has an iconic riff mostly because we're now in 7/8. So that basically means that there are 7 eighth notes in each measure. So after the intro with all the crazy cash registers, yeah, we're in the key of B minor, using that 7/8 riff, counting that simple 7 eighth notes per measure. And the song is really, really awesome. It's really, really catchy. It's got a really awesome sax solo, as well as a really cool guitar solo. So the sax solo takes on 7/8, and then the guitar goes into 4/4. So the chord progression behind the guitar solo simply uses some bluesy chromatic lines. So the song is more of their like pop sort of song that a lot of people really recognize the album from. It's really, really awesome. Us and Them is the next song that we'll talk about, which we fade from the tail end of Money into a synth playing a D major chord. So the chords A over E, B minor add 11, F augmented, G major, and then back to D major is what we're dealing with. So the F augmented chord, strangely enough, is borrowed from the parallel harmonic minor, yes, you heard me correctly, D minor, because of the raised leading tone in D harmonic minor is C sharp. So remember when we talked about those parallel keys, this is what we can do as well, is go to the parallel harmonic minor. So the chord is resolved to G major, which works because the C sharp wants to go to D, the 5th of G. So it's a very unconventional way to move in terms of your harmony, but it actually works really, really well in this case. So you see, when you really understand chord function, common tones, things like that, you can basically move from one chord to almost any chord that you want to, as long as you understand these kinds of functions. It does take time, and you have to learn from the rules of the circle of fifths first before any rule breaking that we're talking about, obviously. But if you want to go to my beginner tutorials about the circle of fifths, go ahead and check that out. It'll really help you out a lot. Anyways, the 4/1 cadence at the end of this chord progression is what is known as the plagal cadence. This cadence isn't really as common as the perfect cadence, obviously, as the plagal cadence doesn't really have as satisfying of an ending, but was mostly used in the 19th century, which makes sense because this was after we got done with the Baroque era where rules were very, very proper, right? So I've talked about cadences a lot on this channel, and basically what it is it's how we're ending a section of the song with chords or the entire song in general. So there are 4 different kinds of cadences. There's the perfect cadence, there's the half cadence, the deceptive cadence, and then what we have is the plagal cadence, okay? The perfect cadence is 5/1, so it's the dominant to the tonic, so the tension and the release, that's the most common. There's the half cadence, which ends with the 5, okay? So it's usually a 1-5, and then we stop there. Then there's the deceptive cadence, which is the 5 to the 6. So it sounds like you're going to go to the 5, but then you go to the 6. Then there's the plagal cadence, which is the simple 4/1. Anyways, at measure 42, we get a very cool move into B Phrygian as the following chords like C major and G major are heard. Any color you like, using a vamp of D minor 7 and G7, as well as F major, which sounds like D is the tonic, leading me to believe that this is in the key of D Dorian, so even more modal harmony and melody writing. Only until about 3 minutes and 13 seconds in, we finally get a B flat, but then falling into A minor, then E flat major, F major, C minor, C sharp diminished, and then landing in D major, which takes us to the next song, Brain Damage. So a really cool transition there. So Brain Damage, going into that, is in the key of D major, using some cool chords in the verse, like the D to G7 repeated, and then into E major, and then the E goes to an A7. So then we got the chorus going from G to A to C, and then back to G. So pretty simple in that department. So the verse, I would say, is in D major, and the chorus, I would say, is in G major. Some borrowed chords, as we've obviously seen, like the 5 of 5, so G7 in the key of D major, could also be known as borrowing the F natural, perhaps from the parallel minor D minor, so more borrowing from the parallel keys. So the closing track, Eclipse, starts in the key of D major using D, D over C, B flat, and A, with tons of chord extensions, extra layers, harmony, some just really big finale sounding aspects in the song and these crazy layers. So some of the chords, of course, are borrowed from the parallel minor D minor, and that ends up how they close it with the fading heartbeat towards the end. So like this great big finale of the record, and that is pretty much it for The Dark Side of the Moon. So overall, this had to be one of my favorite albums to analyze. I didn't know that it would be this ridiculous and crazy with all these chord borrowing, the parallel stuff, and just all this modulation is honestly crazy for back then. And yeah, I really hope you learned something. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.